Hey, what's up YouTube? This is Tcg Sam here, and in today's video, I'm going to be talking about the best hand traps for the post-Justice Hunters format. We're a little bit into the format now, so we have a better idea of what some of the decks are going to look like. So I wanted to cover probably the most important points of interaction that like every deck will be able to play, being hand traps. So with all that being said, let's hop straight into it. Starting off with Ashe, I think Ashe is, I would say, like a must-play hand trap this format, not because it's a particularly good hand trap into like everything, but I think the value it provides in being able to stop chummies is something that's like incredibly powerful for all the best decks. As a hand trap itself, it probably isn't stopping anyone's turn, but I think the fact that most people have a general consensus that chummies are some of the best hand traps that we have right now because they put a lot of pressure on your opponent, and even the decks that can play through low impact hand traps have to sort of respect them. I think that having an ability to stop those can be incredibly powerful. Not to mention, it also has some other use cases, like on your turn 0 when your opponent tries to interact with you using a card like K9 Azuna or Holy Soup. You're also able to stop those from resolving, which is also something that's really strong. So I think Ashe's application is more so just like making sure your own plays go through as opposed to actually stopping your opponent. But I think that there just isn't another card that really does that as well as Ash Blossom. So I think for that reason, I'll put Ashe in the must play. If you're playing hand traps, this is probably the first one that you're choosing. Next up is Imperm. I'll put it at the bottom on must play because I think Imperm, being a trap card, is very good, allowing to play around cards like the K9 stuff, making sure they don't get as much value, which I think is really important against like some of the best decks in like K9 Make or Soul. Not to mention, going second, it can also be a solid enough board breaker on its own and flexible enough to even do something when drawn as your 6th card. I think that's something that's really important when you're building your deck with a bunch of hand traps. I generally try to pick the hand traps that have at least some utility, even when you see it like not in your opening hand, and cards like Imperm I think do that really well. But I think the biggest reason why it's gone up from like previous formats is because it plays around the K9 cards really well. Next up is Veiler. I would say Veiler is something that's like definitely a lot worse than Imperm. Imperm isn't already a super high impact hand trap, and I think Veiler is just definitely a step down. The reason I'm not putting it unplayable is because like you can search in a deck like Blue Eyes. If you pair it with a bunch of other hand traps like Nib or something, like it can't be good. So I think Veiler is probably just fine. It's not crazy, but I wouldn't really choose to play this unless you're playing like a very, very high count of other hand traps. Mortar, I'd say, is like generally unplayable. Like if cards like Veiler aren't even that high impact, a card that's more niche than Veiler is just not going to be much better, I think. So Mortar goes in unplayable. I don't really think there's a reason why you'd play Mortar right now. Next up is Cherries. Cherries is also unplayable, and I think that might be weird to some people, like, because in theory you can use it against like Yummy deck or something, Banish Snatchy, and in theory that's supposed to be pretty good. But the problem with that is the Yummy field spells can recycle from the Banish, so if they get a field spell into the graveyard, the Cherries effectively has done nothing. So I think that in the matchup where Cherries is supposed to be the best, it doesn't even do anything. Like, there's just no reason to play Cherries, especially because we're in such a wide format as well. I don't think that any deck's going to be able to reasonably play enough Cherries targets to be very impactful against the best decks. And not to mention, outside of decks like Yummy, there aren't really that many like key extra deck monsters that are played in like any of the best decks right now that really matter to the deck's central game plan. So I think for that reason, Cherries is just not that good. Next up is Droll, and Droll is interesting because this is like a mainstay like format state before we got Justice Hunters, but this format I think it's gone down a little bit. I'll probably put it in like the solid tier. I still think it's a card that at least needs to be in your side deck to respect decks like Mitsurugi and Raziel, but against like the new Justice Hunters decks, Droll just feels not great. Against the deck like Yummy and Draco Tail, they don't really get affected by Droll too much. Like sure, there are certain hands where Droll hurts a little bit more, but for the most part, I feel like Droll into those decks are like similar as Droll into Malice, like where yes, technically they have searches later on, but they don't need them to go through for their deck to be able to set up like most of their end boards. So I think Droll is just gonna go down a tier because it isn't that good into like the new decks. Against the K9 deck too, it's also kind of risky to Droll them because if they have access to Azuna, you're most likely getting hit with Paradise Smasher, and that will probably just skip your entire turn overall. So I think Droll has just gone down a tier overall from last format. The fact that we still have decks like Mr. Reed Rizzo running around still makes it so Droll is a card I think you have to play, but I don't know if I would even consider main decking this card anymore just because of how poor it matches up into those new Justice Hunters decks. And then next up are the Charmies. I think Meowth is something with like potential, like maybe bottom of solid. Meowth of course is really good against Malice. It also has some applications against Yummy as well. You can even use it on like your own turn, and in theory that could give you like 2, maybe even 3 draws depending on how your opponent chooses to play it. I think that sort of flexibility means like Meowth is something that like I would consider putting in my side deck if you really want specifically hate for like Malice and Yummy, but outside of that, like I don't think Meowth hits like too many other decks that are super relevant. So I feel like Meowth is just going to go in the potential tier. Puruli, I think overall is a very solid hand trap right now. Puruli, of course, is still really good into the old decks like Mitsurugi Raziel. It's fine into a deck like Meowth. In theory, it can be okay into Yummy as well, depending on like what their opening hand is. Sometimes they'll need to play into it, sometimes they won't. And then against like Vanquish Soul Canine, this is a very good card. You can even use it like during your first turn, like turn 0 against Vanquish Soul Canine. And I think that extra flexibility in the Mulcharmies now makes them some of the better hand traps that we have in the format, just because you can use them whether you go first, turn 0, whether you're going second, or even as your 6th draw in some cases. And then for the last Mulcharmy, Fulos, I think this is probably like the best Mulcharmy that we have at the moment. Feels like every single deck is at least impacted by Fulos a decent amount, no matter whether it's like an old one like Mitsu Raziel or Meowth, or it's a new one like a deck like Yummy, for example. I think every single like one of the best decks right now is affected by Fulos, and Fulos will put a decent amount of pressure on any of them and force them to really consider whether or not they want to go for their full board or just end on a half board. Fulos is probably the Mulcharmy that I think everyone should be maining, and then you can make an argument for either siding or just not playing like the other Mulcharmies. Not to mention, Fulos also has some applications against like K9 and Yummy, even as your 6th card. You can Fulos them during like your standby phase, and then against the K9 deck, whenever they rank up with the quick play spell, you get a draw. Against the Yummy deck, more relevantly, like every time they quick synchro on your turn, which is a lot, you're gonna get quite a few draws off that Fulos. So even if you see Fulos as your 6th card, I think it still has a ton of value, and for that reason, I'm gonna put in the must play tier. Next up is Phantasme. I think Phantasme is something with like potential still. Like in theory, it can be pretty decent against Yummy. It has having the effect to protect against targeting, can be pretty good against them, and they're always going to go into Snatchy turn 1 as well. And not to mention against the deck like Meowth is also pretty solid. Of course, they still spam a bunch of Link Bodies out onto the board. So I think similarly to Meowth, if you want a card that's like good against Yummy and good against Meowth specifically, I think Phantasme is definitely a very solid option. It also has some slight coverage into a deck like Vanquish Soul as well, because they do have Rock of the Vanquisher. But I don't think Phantasme is a card that you'll ever be able to play in your main deck. You're definitely going to have to side deck it. And then Phantasme is also only going to be as good as the cards that you draw. So like if you don't draw like great cards off Phantasme, it doesn't really get that much value. It's like fine for the most part, but I think in general, like Phantasme is something that like maybe has some consideration because of its applications against Yummy and Meowth. Next up, Cycle Reader. I would say this card is like pretty unplayable right now. Yes, you can use it to hit Blue Eyes and Feast decks, but I think those have kind of like just not been super relevant in the format lately, especially with the new Justice Hunters decks. I think less and less people are going to be playing them, and so for that reason, I just don't think like there's any reason to play this very targeted hate. Next up is Contact C. I think Contact C is something that has like a tiny bit of potential. That's very specifically just against like the Yummy deck. Its efficacy really depends on how much Yummy players like really want to respect this card. If they play like just a single card or 2 cards in their extra deck, they can sort of just circumvent Contact C's like impact at all. But on the other hand, like if they don't respect Contact C at all, or if they start with a card like Obedience Schooled, it can be pretty devastating against the Yummy deck. So I think this card is really hit or miss. It depends on how much hate you really want to side for Yummy, and whether or not like the Yummy players ultimately decide to respect this card. So because I think like if they don't respect it, this card's actually like I think pretty solid, because it can turn skip a Yummy player. But if they do respect it, this card is like almost unplayable, I think. So I'll kind of put it in the middle ground for now. It really depends how Yummy players choose to play against this card. Next up is Retaliating C. I think Retaliating C is something with like some potential. I think the only relevant deck that it's like really good against is a deck like Draco Tail potentially, and against a deck like Memento. But I think Memento is just not going to be super popular this upcoming format either. But against Draco Tail, like they do have spells that do attempt to special summon their fusion monsters, and it's really good if you're able to banish the materials because they won't get their effects. But it's not like the deck has like no outs to Retaliating C either. They have like a monster effect to fuse, and then like one of their boss monsters can just like bounce the Retaliating C back to hand. Retaliating C, like outside of the Draco Tail matchup, just isn't really any reason to consider it. But the only reason I'm putting it in like not unplayable is because at least it has like some niche application in those certain matchups. Meister, I think, is also something with like a tiny bit of potential. I don't think this card is like unplayable, although I don't think it's ever going to be high impact enough to really do much. Like in theory, it can be good against a lot of the best decks like Mitsu Raziel. It can be good against like Draco Tail, good against like pretty much most other like rogue matchups as well. So it'll rarely ever be like completely dead, but I just feel like its impact is just not good enough to play to justify playing in this current format. No Material and Token Collector I think are like borderline unplayable. There should be no reason for you to even really consider these hand traps. Shifter I think is something that is pretty solid in this upcoming format. It's obviously pretty good against a deck like Yummy, really good against a deck like Draco Tail. This should like destroy every single rogue deck. The only problem is like against a deck like Malice, against a deck like K9 Banker Soul, and even like arguably against a deck like Mitsurugi Raziel, Shifter just isn't that high impact. I think overall Shifter, like, it does hit enough decks for it to be considered a solid hand trap, but I think also not every deck's gonna be able to play this, and so it probably just won't actually end up seeing that much play overall, even though like its effect is probably fine in today's format. Typhoon I think is unplayable. Like, it was only really good against Blue Eyes, and that deck just doesn't feel that real anymore. Personally, I want to say like Nibiru is actually like bottom of solid, top of potential, with the caveat that like you are playing a hand trap build of the deck. Like if you're playing like 18 plus hand traps with like Nibiru, I think you're reasonably going to see Nibiru paired with some other interaction enough to where Nibiru has enough of an impact. I think the problem with Nibiru is like every single one of the best decks either just doesn't play into it, like a deck like Draco Tail, or every single one of the best decks just has a way to play around it, like a deck like Mouse or Yummy. They just have extenders that can push through Nibiru after getting hit with them. So Nibiru as like a standalone card just feels like really bad, but if you're able to pair it with other hand traps and stop your opponent from getting access to those extenders, I think Nibiru can be one of the most high impact hand traps in the game. It is very risky, I think, to play it though, because of a deck like K9. They make Ripper like really early on to be able to negate Nibiru, and like I mentioned, like all these other decks just have like infinite extenders to, in theory, play through Nibiru as well. So Nibiru is something that like I think really depends on how you build your deck. If you want to play Nibiru, I think in a deck with like 18 to 21 hand traps, it can definitely be a reasonable choice. Chaos Hunter I think is like something like I would almost say is like unplayable. Malice is just one of like 5 top contenders that are relevant in the format right now. I don't think you can play such targeted hate towards Malice, but Lancey on the other hand I think is like a must play. It just feels like a generally better version of Chaos Hunter, and I think you still are going to want to respect Malice as a deck just because of how strong it is. Not to mention, against a deck like K9 Crystron as well, also has some applications and some overlapping coverage there. So I guess Lancia is probably something that's still worth playing just to respect a deck like Malice. K9 Zuna I think is, I want to say like top a solid, bottom a must play. Obviously if you're playing like a K9 deck, this card is incredible and it's definitely a card you want to play at 3, but if you're just considering Azuna as like a generic hand trap, and that's what I'm doing here, I think it's a decent hand trap. When it gets to the resolve, it's probably one of the most high impact hand traps in the game because you're getting yourself a free body, whether it's through a card like Valon, whether it's through a card like Nash Knight, and then dealing with one of your opponent's monsters. And then on the next turn, in theory, if you play like an Xyz deck, you can threaten a Zeus right away, which is really good. Not to mention, going first, it also acts as an extender if you get hand trapped, and this is going to be more relevant in like the K9 decks, but even if you're not playing a K9 deck, like at least they can give you like one extra form of interruption or one or two extra bodies onto the board. I think the problem with K9 Azuna is that in theory, against a deck like Yummy, they should never be like making your K9 Azuna live just because of how their deck plays inherently. And against a deck like a Malice, for example, they don't necessarily have to play into K9 Azuna all the time either. The fact that K9 Azuna isn't always going to be live in every single matchup kind of makes me not want to put it in must play. But outside of that, I think there's only really good things to say about this card. It's definitely super strong when it resolves, so I'll put it at top of solid for now. Ghost Ogre is an interesting one. I personally am like trying out Ghost Ogre right now, and I think Ghost Ogre is something with like actually some decent potential. And the reason for that is like I think you can use Ghost Ogre on like your turn 0, you can use Ghost Ogre when going second, and you can use Ghost Ogre even as a 6 card sometimes. So on your turn 0, if your opponent hits you with something like K9 Azuna, you can Ogre the Lupus, get rid of Lupus, and then prevent them from making them rank 5. It's really strong. Even against a card like Holy Sue, which you may not think Ghost Ogre does that much against, if your opponent goes Holy Sue, summon Raisin effect, you chain Ogre there. It doesn't really matter if your opponent like has a way to like protect the Raisin by bouncing it back. You're essentially denying the Raisin like from popping a column. Yes, the Raisin's still gonna search for like Caesar, and then you still have to deal with the Caesar pop. But the idea is like at least Ogre trades like 1-for-1 with an interruption in that case, and that can be pretty solid. Of course, going second is against Vanquish Soul. You can hit Field Spell. Field Spell is one of the best cards to hit in the Vanquish Soul deck. You can use it against Yummy to hit their minion Field Spell when going second, making it so it's like harder for you to die that turn, which is really important. Against a deck like Raziel, you can use it to hit Duo Drive. Against a deck like Malice, it's like okay, I guess you can use it to hit a Link 2 body. It's probably more impactful if you pair it with something else, but even standalone, it can remove 2 Link bodies from the field through a card like Splash Mage or Haggard Lizardos, which I think can be okay. So overall, I think that the fact that Ogre has like all these different applications just makes it so like even though it won't ever be a super high impact hand trap, I think the 1-for-1 trades that it allows you to make are some of the most impactful ones that we have in the game right now. So for that reason, I'm gonna put Ogre like at the bottom of solid. I think Ogre is a card that I personally want to try out, and I think this is something that could see more play in the future. Next up, DD Crow. I think DD Crow is something with like some potential. It's like fine. It's not too bad of a card. It should have coverage into like everything except for like Malice, I guess. Against like all the other decks, it won't ever be like super high impact, which I think is a big problem because all these decks right now are just super powerful and have a ton of gas. So even though Crow in theory can trade like 1-for-1 in some cases, I don't think it's just high impact enough to really make a big difference in a lot of the games that you see it. Bell is something I think with like some potential as well. Like similarly as Ogre, it's able to stop a card like Azuna on your turn 0. It has some applications there. It can be useful against a deck like Malice, hitting cards like GWC, Whitebinder, Field Spell. You can use it against like Dracotail as well, even as your 6th card. You can stop their trap card effects with Bell, which is actually kind of cool. I think overall Bell is just a hand trap that's like okay at best. Like it feels like it should have coverage into everything, but it just doesn't feel like it'll ever be super high impact. Maybe against a deck like Yummy, if your opponent only ends on like a single Synchro 2 and somehow like doesn't have access to Surprise or something, Bell can be pretty good in that case, stopping the Synchro 2 from taking out. But I think Bell is a hand trap that you absolutely have to pair with other hand traps for it to be super impactful. All the use cases that I mentioned, like your opponent has already in theory started to play at that point, and if you're not able to stop them from getting to that spot, Bell just isn't that high impact. But if you're able to pair Bell with something else, I think in theory it could be fine. Vados is something I actually think would like has some potential in the current format. It did see a little bit of play at the EUWCQ and Vanquisol. I think the theory is like solid behind this. A lot of the best decks in this format do have field spells, like decks like Malice, decks like Yummy, decks like Vanquisol. They all have field spells which are relatively impactful for you to hit with Vados. But I think you get the most value out of Vados specifically in Vanquisol because of the ability to like set it on your opponent's field and then use a card like Raisin to on demand like blow up your opponent's field whenever you want. That interaction with Raisin sort of pushes it over like the unplayable tier into like potential. Like you can start considering it in a deck like Vanquisol because it is the right attribute. It does hit like some pretty impactful field spells, and then like the synergy with Raisin as well. I think in every other deck though, like it's not hand trap I think I would personally choose to play, but overall, I think that Vados is solid enough of a hand trap in Vanquisol at least be in the potential tier. And then next up for the side frames, I think Gamma solid, Delta something with like low potential, and then Epsilon is as usual unplayable. Gamma I think is a little bit less good now compared to last format. Even against like the old decks like Mitsu Raziel and Malice, is also kind of like the same thing. Yes, Gamma was high impact in some cases, but I feel like Gamma's like viability has kind of dropped off a little bit from last format just because we introduced so many more powerful decks into the metagame. Delta is also something that's like fallen down a little bit as well. I don't think it's going to be super impactful against any of the best decks. If against a deck like K9, against a deck like Yummy, they do have key spell cards that are pretty good, but it just feels like those decks have so much gas that they're always able to play through Delta anyways, and playing the driver just doesn't really seem like a worthwhile trade-off for playing Delta. And then Epsilon, this card has just always been unplayable. Bystials, I think, are also something like at the top of the solid tier. Maybe you can argue they're must play, but I think unless your deck can take advantage of like the bodies that Bystial gives you, like Malice, or has some extra synergy with them like Malice does, I think Bystials are probably just something that like you maybe want to consider. As hand traps, they're also kind of like DD Crow in the sense that like they shouldn't ever be like passing your opponent's turn, but there are some situations where they can be good going as like your 6th card. They can be good to cut off 1 point of like extension from a card like Yummy Minion. Against a deck like Mitsu Raziel, of course, is still pretty good. And of course, Magnema and Jerusalem are still some of the best like monsters that we have in the game right now. So I think all those reasons combined make me want to put it in like a solid tier. Like, don't get me wrong, I think the Bystials are very strong cards, but I just don't feel like as hand traps they're actually going to be able to stop your opponent, which is kind of what I feel like you want with hand traps this format. You want to like outright stop your opponent from like building a board because the end boards are almost all unbreakable. Even though in theory like board breakers are better this format, I think like you actually want to lean towards like preventing your opponent from making the board in the first place as opposed to trying to break through it. But that's just my opinion at like the start of the format, and I guess that could change as the format goes on. And then for the Dominus cards, I think Songs is something with like some potential. I think the only deck that can really play this is Yummy, and even in the Yummy deck, not every Yummy version is going to play it. So I think for that reason, it just is like kind of the definition of potential. There's really no other relevant deck I think that I can think of that can choose to play this other than Yummy. Impulse is definitely a must play if you have access to it. But then realistically, the only decks that have access to Impulse are a Mouse and Lunalight. But in those decks, there's just be no reason for you not to play Impulse. It's one of the higher impact hand traps that's good into every single deck right now. Dominus Purge, I think, is something that's solid as well. Once again, not every deck can play it, but I think a really relevant deck that can play it is Yummy. And in the Yummy deck, Dominus Purge, similar to Impulse and Imperm, is a trap card, so they're not going to play into the K9 cards either. And Purge's effect is just decent overall as well, so I think for that reason it's just a solid card. If you're playing Yummy, you probably want to play this in your hand trap version and maybe even your board breaker version. And then lastly, Dogwood. I think Dogwood is pretty unplayable. Once we get those new time rules, I don't think Dogwood's really going to do anything. So that's going to do it for this tier list. Let me know what you thought about in the comment section below. Overall, my thoughts on the format are that hand traps don't really feel too great at the moment, but they kind of feel like you still have to play them because the end boards people make are just so strong. Even though every deck is super strong, you can in theory play through multiple hand traps. This is just the approach I think is a little bit safer to take than a board breaker approach. Although I can see an argument for the board breakers, because if you start pairing board breakers as well, in theory you should also be able to break through a lot of the end boards, but that may not be the case against older decks like Mitsu Raizel or Mouse, which kind of makes it so we're at a weird point to where you kind of want to focus on the Justice Hunter decks, but at the same time you can't really disrespect Mouse and Mitsu Raizel as well. Overall, whether you choose to play hand traps to try to stop your opponent, or whether you choose to play board breakers and not play into cards like K9, the K9s or Paradise Smasher, that's ultimately up to you. But I personally feel that if you are to play hand traps, this is how I would rank them overall. But I'm curious to hear what you guys think about hand traps in general, or if you agree or disagree with the list that I made. But with all that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I will see you guys in the next one. Take care.